Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is June 19th. Pardon me, June 19th, 2019. That's a couple of 19s in there, and Juneteenth as well. So let's, I don't know what else to say about that. It's true, it's real, and here we are. Daily Co's Radio is live now. I am informed reliably by Bill in Portland, Maine, who could not possibly know that this is the case. I don't think. We ought to look into this and possibly impeach him for this insider knowledge. At the very least, he's trading on inside information. Kagro X, he claims, is alive, and that's really a problem enough, don't you think? With thoughts and motives and complex biological processes, including the search for toothpicks, that you and I will never fully understand. There's no way you could, right? Dear God, I hope they get his containment dome finished before it's too late, and I agree. Let's get these workmen started on the containment dome. The sooner the better. For no particular reason. I don't know. I'm not certain. What would you say is the hot topic this morning on Twitter? I think I'm not sure I want to admit to this, but it appears that it is, and I can't tell exactly who is arguing on what side and why, but everyone is arguing about whether or not it's. I don't even know. Are they arguing about whether or not we have now, under Trump, concentration camps at the border, whether we have had them in the past, whether or not only Nazis can have concentration camps, whether or not it's okay to say the word concentration camps. The fights are breaking out all over the place. I don't really know how to follow this one, but Greg has been following, and perhaps, I don't know whether he wants to spend any time on it or not. There's plenty of other things we could be spending our time on. But once again, I guess the plan is working. Somebody's plan. There's somebody out there that we can imagine has an evil and intricate plan to divide people along the lines of whether or not they think it's okay for someone else to get annoyed or angry about maybe the fight over the use of the words. It's really crazy out there. But luckily, we do have Greg Dworkin joining us. He can actually explain what's going on. I think I missed the start of the fight, but I believe I understand where it came from. And I guess ultimately all you really have to know is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said something. And so therefore, here we are. Not only does somebody else want to critique her for it, and I think the first one out of the box was Lynn Cheney. And, well, she's terrible, so that's only going to make things worse. That's fanning the flames. And then there's fights on the right over whether or not, I don't know, something socialism, and then fights on the left about, well, do you really want to say that? And don't you think that's a distraction from the issue? It's awful. Meanwhile, Donald Trump had another rally, and I don't know that we should really cover that any more closely than anything else, but you know how those things go. He says some crazy things. Some people analyze them. Some of them are more important than others. Some are things that we all roll our eyes at, but also say, well, the more time we spend covering that, the less time we'll spend covering, I don't know, concentration camps, and then we get back into the fight over whether or not it was okay to say that, wherein the guy who is building the camps is having a rally in Orlando, Florida, and the very fine Nazis from both sides are marching around on the outside, insisting that they are there to protect them from liberals, probably by beating those liberals up, even though those liberals are also not there at the rally. So it's been a hell of a morning for something. We just don't know what exactly. Well, we'll see if we can't break it down and fix it in the way of substance. Well, nothing's actually happening. Next week, though, we're supposed to round up millions of undocumented immigrants and ship them out of the country somehow. with personnel, equipment, and logistical planning that we do not have and have no access to. So I guess we could start that fight. Is it okay to concern ourselves with something as trivial, as piddling as the President of the United States insisting in public remarks that he is going to remove millions of undocumented immigrants next week? Or do we say, well, since he can't do that and probably can't logistically make it happen, it's a distraction and you need not or ought not to pay any attention to it for fear of losing sight of outrage B for the day. All right. Well, Greg Dworkin is here. Let's see if we can figure out what's going on in terms of, I don't know, are we allowed to be annoyed or angry, and at whom?
Yep.
And okay, good. As long as it's okay. We're already annoyed and angry. Most of the people who know about what's going on are already set in their annoyance and anger. And if you have missed it, or at least partially missed it, like me, you're annoyed and angry that you don't understand yet what to be annoyed and angry about.
Pretty much.
Okay.
So
good.
basically what happened is that there were news stories about the Trump administration rounding up undocumented immigrants, those seeking asylum. It's really not clear because it's a potpourri of anybody they get their hands on.
Yeah. Maybe
and
even
they're
some
squeezing
citizens.
them into small jails, except they're not jails, because to call them jails implies that they're part of the legal system. And in fact, the whole point here is that they're not American citizens, and you're taking them out of the legal system and doing extra legal things to them, which, of course, the courts haven't really been happy about. And so the Trump administration has been dinged on that. But it's getting worse. And, of course, one of the things they did is decide to use as one of these areas to concentrate people in a small space are some places that were also used historically to do the same thing to the Japanese in World War II. So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez doing what she does, bringing this to light and getting a lot of attention for it. And she says, this administration has established concentration camps on the southern border of the United States for immigrants where they're being brutalized with dehumanizing conditions and dying. Literally packed into small spaces where you have to stand up because there's no room to sit down. There's not hyperbole, she says. It's the conclusion of expert analysis, gives cites for that, and then says, and for the shrieking Republicans who don't know the difference, concentration camps are not the same as death camps. A point, by the way, the Auschwitz Memorial also made. Concentration camps are considered by experts as the mass detention of civilians without trial. And that's exactly what this administration is doing. So, of course, Lynn Cheney challenged her on that, and conservative Twitter lit up. And Chris Hayes points out special laurels to those who don't really care about the camps, but care a ton about how they're characterized. Real profile and courage.
Yes. Well, the PR for camps is important.
Right. Yeah, it is. So that's where a lot of this. Let me give you some illustrative tweets about this. Andrew Lawrence tweeting, historians, concentration camps are actually what they are. Journalists, but it makes the right wing uncomfortable. Historians, yeah, I mean, it should. Journalists, but it's a highly charged term. Historians, well, that's the point. Journalists, but it describes atrocities. Historians, silently looking at the journalists.
Yeah. Well, I see that the fight has spread to often otherwise reliable left-leaning voices saying, well, I think you're needlessly inflaming the whatever you might be needlessly inflaming.
Or not inflaming enough. Here's one.
Oh, yes, really? Terrific.
Chris Hayes.
The Russians are really great at this. All right.
Yeah, Chris Hayes says, the last comment on this, concentration camp is an extremely charged term, and I get why many people are in good faith uncomfortable with its application for Godwin's law purposes, among others.
That's been suspended.
So let's just call them detention camps and focus on what's happening in them. And Mike Godwin says, Chris, I think they're concentration camps. Keep in mind that one of their functions by design is to punish those individuals and families who are detained. So even the charge term is appropriate, says Godwin.
All right. Well, you're wrong.
Right? So
and another thing,
it's like that Woody Allen scene in Annie Hall where he pulls out Marshall McLuhan.
Right,
You know nothing about my work. So the whole idea here, though, is that it is, in fact, a legitimate discussion, and it's just a very weird dynamic to watch right-wing Twitter lecture people about, it's Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez going off and how crazy is the left. Well, actually, let me give you some historian perspective. This is Federico Finkelstein, professor at the New School.
That's real.
As historian of fascism and Holocaust, I would also call these centers concentration camps. As a Jewish person who lost family in the Holocaust, I regret that some Republicans use memory of the Holocaust to defend racist policies of Trumpism. AOC is right about this. Just to give you a flavor, I'm going to give you a few more because I think they're illustrative but also important.
It's interesting. Yes.
Okay. This one is from Lester Andrist, who's sociological seeker of social justice, but he's from Maryland, USA. I've heard of that. I did my dissertation on concentration camps, so I have a few thoughts about AOC's use of the term to describe the buildup of camps on the U.S. southern border. For those in a hurry, here's the take-home message. By any reasonable definition, these are concentration camps. Oh, wow. And so the distinction between a concentration camp and death camp and extermination camp, of course, is an important one, but one did start as the other.
That's true.
Why are they called concentration? Now, it doesn't mean that all of them, therefore, must progress.
Right.
But it starts somewhere. They didn't start with full-blown death camps. Why are they called concentration camps? Well, to state the obvious is because large numbers of people are concentrated in camps. The better question is, and a point I just made, why don't we call them prisons? We don't say prisons because prisons are part of the formal legal system. Follow me on this. The immigrants detained in concentration camps are intended to be outside the formal legal system. Once removed, the state is largely free to do whatever it wants. As Hannah Arendt might say, everything is possible. And then goes on. And that's what makes concentration camps so terrifying. Detainees have no privilege of habeas corpus to be charged or let go. They can be held indefinitely, unable to see their family, and denied the psychological comfort of knowing when and if they'll ever see them again. And it gets worse. And he describes how it gets worse. And we were talking about this on Twitter. Someone else here, academic coaching. I did my dissertation on Hannah Arendt, and I just want to say I think that Alexandria Ocasio is perfectly correct.
Okay.
Right? And then finally, I was tweeting some of these historian academic type responses, and one of the people / groups, corporations of people too, I guess memorials are, who was trying to make the point, and the distinction is that they both exist, and it's okay to talk about concentration camps, was the Auschwitz Memorial.
What do they know?
And when I retweeted them, they wrote and said, I'm from Connecticut. Thank you for the RT, and thank you for remembering. And please follow us. Okay. It's a thing. And people were out there talking about it because somehow to minimize the fact that these are concentration camps and these are people outside of the legal system who are being mistreated. I mean, these are baby jails. President baby jails and his baby jails are still a thing, and it's only getting worse. And trying to deny that, denialism, is the thing. It's especially a thing from the extreme right wing who likes to deny that the Holocaust happened at all. But it's just so weird to say, okay, well, on behalf of people who didn't ask you to, we're going to defend the memory of the Holocaust by denying you the right to call anything else concentration camps. Well, no, that's not how it works.
It's interesting that they would cling to concentration camps as that thing and only that thing that happened in Nazi Germany, given that, concentration camps, I think they already conceded in this is a euphemism for what the Nazis used those camps for. Why
you may have, in your time, once upon a time perhaps, misused or, to their mind, misused a term about guns, and therefore you're not qualified to discuss guns anymore. Right that's what this is.
Yeah, I guess that's a good parallel to it. We're stuck in the debate over. We can't even agree on it. Well, no, we can agree on a lot of things. One, you're wrong. Two, you're a Nazi. Right? Oh, you don't agree?
I can't remember. You either called it a magazine or you didn't call it a magazine, but somehow or other, that disqualifies you from discussing the entire issue of gun safety. That's what this is. Yes. You use concentration camp in a way we don't like because it makes us uncomfortable. You happen to be historically correct, but we say you're not correct, and therefore, because we say you're not correct, we also say you're therefore not qualified to discuss this, and besides, AOC.
Yes. All right. I think that's probably the best synopsis of what's actually going on here that I've seen so far. Certainly I now understand the Republican tactic on it. I'm not certain I understand why others are fighting about it on the left, although I get
because
getting a good
people like
picture
Chris
of it.
Hayes says, okay, so maybe we should use detention camps. Let's be nice to the other side and try not to stir things up.
It's interesting. I'm not
And
sure
people
whether
on
he
the
was trying
left
to be
are saying,
nice to the other
wait
side.
a minute, stir them up. That's what this is. What are you taking that away for?
Yeah, I suspect that he's not concerned about being accommodating of the right. I have this feeling
he's thinking
that
out
he's
loud, and people are attacking him for that.
Well, I think, and he might be. I thought he was reacting to reaction from the left, saying, "Well, now hold on a second. As horrible as what the Republicans and Trump are doing here now, let's not put it on a par with Nazi Germany because that somehow diminishes the Holocaust."
That's also called reasonable people having a reasonable discussion and back and forth and give and take. And I hear what you're saying, and I appreciate that you brought it up, and I'll try to accommodate that into my thinking, which is what's happening on the left.
I assume.
And what's happening on the right is, we found a term that we could use to bludgeon them with, take it out of historical context, and just keep hitting them on it because it appears to be working for our side.
I guess that's one way of distinguishing it. So if you find yourself caught in that bind somewhere, you can say, so time out just as a question. Do you want to keep discussing what's happening in these facilities? If they say yes, you're talking to a leftist who disagrees about the terminology. If they say no, you've discovered a right-winger who is looking to bludgeon you into silence.
And that's why I gave you Chris Hayes' quote on that. Special laurels for those who don't really care about the camps, but care a ton about how they're characterized.
Okay.
Real profile and courage. That's exactly right.
Okay, good. We've got it. That was pretty quick.
Okay, so that's you got the big picture there?
Yes.
And you don't know anything about guns either, so don't ever talk to me about it.
I don't know anything about that. I've never heard that mentioned on this show.
Right. Oh, by the way, this is interesting. This is Joe Bernstein, reporter for BuzzFeed News, who reports new from BuzzFeed News. A former Republican operative notorious for his connections to white nationalists has been publishing op-eds in the Wall Street Journal under a pen name. In an odd statement, the journal claims not to have known.
Oh, well, I mean, what? Right? They didn't know.
His name is Marcus Epstein, a former associate of Richard Spencer, former contributor to white nationalist site VDare, who's written for the Wall Street Journal, The Hill, various and sundry other things. And he is a former Republican operative, and he writes under the name Mark Epstein.
That's
how to keep online speech free. Authoritarian really regimes aren't the only threat. European nations have restrictions too.
Okay. All right.
And you scratch your head and say, okay, is this a both sides discussion here where everybody's playing on an equal playing field? No. No. And so which side is going to do citations explaining to us that they own memory of the Holocaust and they're the only ones who really have the right to interpret things?
I will do that.
Not this side.
Oh, no?
Not the side that had the Proud Boys with white nationalist signs marching at the Trump rally in Florida. I'm sorry. It's not a symmetric thing here. And so, I think we have to recognize what's going on here. And, the reason that many on the right are trying to make it a thing, is varied. But to some, it's just a weapon. And to others, it really makes them uncomfortable to be reminded of what happened in World War II with Japanese Americans, which is why George Takei's work is so important. And, the parallels are uncomfortable, and so they want to change the topic and make it about AOC.
Okay.
Because that's a much more comfortable thing to attack people on.
Yeah, that's, everybody has fun attacking people about AOC. I see it. There's also a sideline fight. I don't want to spend any time on it, but the thing that I have my eye on here is a fight between, believe this, NYC Southpaw, everyone's good Twitter friend, and Greg Sargent are at one another's throats over this. The latest, all I can say is the latest in the exchange is Greg Sargent huffing that I said explicitly that this is worthy of outrage. Anyway, he had a tweet that he deleted because he says Southpaw successfully imposed your false spin on it. Congrats, you won. So that's where we are, as between those two guys on the concentration camp issue. That's not good.
Uh,
All right. Well,
Okay.
maybe somebody didn't have enough coffee or something.
maybe.
Uh,
Another couple of comments I thought
now
were
what we're
interesting
supposed to
about
be
this.
doing. Yeah.
Sally Albright says, the problem is not that Trump's base doesn't understand how bad he is. The problem is the rest of America doesn't understand how bad Trump's base is.
No. Yes. Well, okay. I'll take
Right.
that.
Right? And this is in the context of talking about, this whole thing about concentration camps. Somebody else tweets, I don't know the name of the Holocaust survivor who said Americans, like pre-World War II Germans, have to realize a third of their citizens want to kill another third of the citizens while a third watch. Is it that bad? I don't know. But there's a reason why, invoking issues of World War II don't all have to come down to extermination camps. As Auschwitz Memorial explains, places like Auschwitz were both work camps and extermination camps. They had a dual role. And so forgetting about the first and just concentrating on the second, pun intended, is missing a big picture of what was going on there and how people could justify to themselves and to others what they were doing. Well, it was all for the war effort.
Yes, and when you described it that way, about 1/3 wanting to kill the other third while the other third watched, I thought you were describing the Revolutionary War effort, but I guess not.
Well, 3%ers and all that.
It seems I think we enter almost all wars that way.
So we'll see how it goes with the Iran war that's on the horizon. So again, it's an emotionally fraught issue. For those of us who have relatives involved, it's an even more emotionally fraught issue. And of course, this is one of those things where you're going to wind up picking your experts, right? You're going to find some conservative rabbis who say it's awful, it's horrible, it's terrible. But people outside the Jewish religion have to understand and remember that rabbis don't speak for the population. It's not how it's organized. It's not like they're the Pope.
Right, true.
And so what happens is if you have a very conservative, ultra-Orthodox group of people who happen to, let's say, support Donald Trump, that doesn't mean that,
Right.
the 78% of Jews that have voted against him are represented by those particular spokespeople. But nonetheless,
so.
they'll be out there speaking, and somebody will choose them and say, you see, this is what Jews think.
Right, and that's when we'll bring in the ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionists.
Anyway, so
And
that's
anti-vaxxers.
that's my rant for this morning. But I think it's
Thank
important
you.
to put all of that in context.
I think so, and the context continues to grow as we speak, but I think that's a pretty good rundown of it, and probably more, unfortunately, more time than we really should give it. But that people are talking about it. It's deeply felt. I wish I could snap my fingers
Hey,
and make it go
you know
away,
what people aren't talking about?
Yes, but there are many things. Which one are you thinking of?
The Trump rally yesterday.
That one. Yeah. Oh, that one I didn't.
People thought
want
was
to-
kind of boring, and why cover it? And in fact,
Yes.
a lot of the networks didn't.
Good. It's about
But
time.
it's his big announcement. It's his inauguration. He's running for
what?
president again. Why
What?
did you
No,
not
you're
cover
kidding.
it? Because it's the same rally he's been giving for 2 years. It's not news.
Right. The news was made mostly, it seems like, outside of the rally, or in discussion about what was going on outside. Like, there are 100,000 people out there. No, there aren't. Or
There were empty seats inside,
Yes.
and the other side of the
Nazis are
coin
outside.
is that he mentioned Hillary Clinton like 50,000 times and talked about locking her. I mean, it was a MAGA greatest hits rally,
Yeah.
right? There's nothing new, and therefore it wasn't, all of that notable. Oh, and by the way, where was it?
Orlando?
Orlando.
Yes,
So
right.
it was in Florida,
Right.
of all
Why?
places. Florida, Orlando. Orlando's interesting. Orlando's the paper that published the editorial yesterday or today that basically said we know who we're endorsing for president, and it will not be Donald Trump.
All right. Well, yeah, they may have. I'm sure that they were moved to do it by the fact that they knew that the rally was coming, but they probably
Right,
hadn't
and
around to
perhaps more pertinent, Quinnipiac poll of Florida out yesterday. Listen to these numbers: Biden 50, Trump 41, Sanders 48, Trump 42, Warren 47, Trump 43, Harris 45, Trump 44, Buttigieg 44, Trump 43, O'Rourke 45, Trump 44. Now, nobody thinks Biden is necessarily going to be the nominee and or he's going to beat the Democrat is going to beat Trump by 9 points in Florida. Good luck with that. That's not the point. The point is he's very vulnerable. He's not doing well. And that's the state he had his rally in because he knows he must win Florida, without Ohio. He's not winning. He's got a better chance of winning Ohio than he does Florida.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, he has a special place in his heart for Florida, but I guess anything that gets him there in June is
he spent more
something
time
uncomfortable.
there. He's done more rallies there. He's spending an inordinate amount of time in Florida, not just because he likes to go to Mar-a-Lago and not because he likes to golf, but because he knows that state is critical to winning the election. Yeah. And right now he's behind.
Yes. I think logistically it's also just a place he knows he can put a crowd together relatively easily. All roads lead to Orlando.
Right. It's Florida. Like you're really a big fan of a particular rock group, and wherever the concert is, you go.
Oh, this is happening. Yes.
This is happening. The same people are showing up at these rallies.
They might be the same
as an example of just how popular Trump is.
Yes. I did see a lot of, at least Twitter reporting of.
Well, if you get in the front row. That's
okay. Of right? People who've said
these are the
their 50th rally, and I've been to every rally he's had since 2016, and things like it. Really is. Pretty
how come you know the locker up? How long did it take? How many rallies did it take you to memorize locker up? 17, 23.
Right. Yeah. Was it up or down? Which one is it?
I don't get it exactly right, but the next one, I know I'm going to nail it.
Yeah, lockdown. Right. That's the term. Right. Lock her down. No.
After the break, we'll talk about how the Q poll looked at the presidential race on the Democratic side, with more polling to come.
Okay, very good. We'll be ready for that one and continue to keep an eye on the smoldering ruins of the political discourse on Twitter this morning. Thanks. We'll be back in 2 minutes. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Or read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Roots Radio. By the way, I guess in wrapping up, possibly, on the concentration camp issue, we are reminded by Jack Ox, listening to the conversation today, every American is, and I guess probably will be in the future, held responsible for the concentration camps. The world will always hold the German people responsible for the concentration camps in Europe. I suppose if it rises to that level, enough people will in fact never forget that we would be responsible. And thankfully, to date, it has not. But as we're continually reminded, sometimes it's only a matter of time. And for those who do remember in the future, whatever level these infractions eventually rise to, they're probably not going to put a great deal of effort into distinguishing between whether you were one of the Americans who argued on side 1 or side 2 or side 1A or 1B or 2A, 2B. The stain will be there for all of us, unfortunately.
Well, there's another piece to it that wasn't there in World War II, and that is the excuse that I didn't know. Oh, you didn't know?
Yeah,
Here's
right.
all your tweets that you were defending.
That's true. But I didn't know what I was doing at the time. That's a possibility.
Yeah, I suppose. So, we talked about the Q poll. Evan Siegfried, who is a Republican strategist who doesn't like to be labeled as a never-Trumper, it makes a lot of Republicans uncomfortable to be called never-Trumpers because they have to work, So, Trump's biggest risk in 2020 isn't losing young people, it's losing their grandparents.
Okay.
The president may still win the majority of seniors, but if he does, by a significantly smaller margin, that spells problems in swing states. Think Florida, which we were just talking about. People 65 and older have
grandparents.
long been solidly Republican, serving as reliable voters who can be counted on not to only turn out more other blocks, but also do so with less effort on the part of campaigns. All you have to do is send them an email, chain email, and then all the seniors come out.
Right, true.
Right, or a postcard, like Richard Biggery used to do. Their support was evident in both the 2010 and the 2014 midterm elections when the GOP won these voters by 21 and 16 points respectively. So, too, was it visible in the last two presidential elections as senior voters backed Mitt Romney by 12 and Donald Trump by 8. However, 2018 witnessed a startling shift towards Democrats. The GOP managed to win voters 65 and older by just 2 points. There are signs it's not a fluke, and the Trump era has caused senior citizens to abandon the GOP in numbers big enough that could produce huge electoral consequences for both congressional Republicans and Trump alike. In April, a Washington Post ABC News poll found that 53% of senior citizens would definitely not vote for Trump in 2020. This disquieting result was obscured in the national discussion by the fact that 62% of women overall and 57% of white women with a college degree stated they wouldn't vote for Trump. That's the suburban women shift. But the fact that 53% of senior citizens would definitely not vote for Trump is a big deal. And actually, on that theme, we have a piece from Aaron Blake in the Washington Post, also in the roundup, which basically says this is Trump's worst poll number and what it means.
Okay.
Okay.
Which one?
There's one poll question I keep coming back to when I think about Trump's 2020 re-election campaign. It's the one in which pollsters asked whether people would definitely not vote for him.
Okay.
Right? It's an especially bad number for Trump. National polls generally show a majority of people, 51 to 56%, say they wouldn't, with Fox News polls being the exception. And now a poll also shows that numbers remarkably bad for Trump in a surprising place, Texas. Texas Tribune poll, I think we talked about that the other day, shows 43% say they'd never back Trump and another 7% say they're inclined to vote against him. That's half the state intending not to vote for a Republican president in Texas. These numbers are apparently starting to register in early 2020 polls, including Trump's own internals, which we also talked about on Monday.
You're fired.
Which showed Trump struggling to climb out of the low 40s in key states and sometimes trailing by double digits. He's also running neck and neck with Joe Biden in Texas. So, again, I've emphasized this. Don't look at how popular he is. Look at how unpopular he is. That tends to drive people to vote a lot more.
Lately, yes.
Right, and the whole idea that 2018 doesn't count because Trump wasn't on the ballot. Trump is always on the ballot.
Yeah, and he'll tell you that.
Right? So, turning from the Republicans to the Democrats, Tina Nguyen, that's Nguyen, Vietnamese. And I pronounce it the Southern Vietnamese style of Nguyen.
Oh.
As opposed to Nguyen, which is more northern.
Really? Okay.
Elizabeth Warren we have a big Vietnamese community in Danbury where I live. And actually, it's probably the most common surname.
Yes, that I run into a lot. I didn't realize that
you must
there
be
was
from
a
Vietnam.
north-south difference in pronunciation. But, well, you know,
I
north
can't
and
pronounce
south,
it the proper way either way.
Okay. Well, that's probably true. You don't get that a lot with the Koreans. You know, the North Koreans don't show up very often to correct your pronunciation, but maybe in the future.
Right. It's the story here is in Vanity Fair. Elizabeth Warren is surging, and the Trump campaign is taking notice. After writing off Warren, the president appears to have realized Pocahontas isn't going to cut it. Okay, and in fact, one can see that in the polls where she tends to be rising. And so let's look at that Q poll in Florida, and then let's look at some overall numbers here. In Florida, Biden was 41, Sanders 14, Warren 12. Buttigieg 8, Harris 6, O'Rourke 1, Booker 1, Klobuchar 1, everybody else less than that.
Okay.
Now, there are older voters in Florida, and older voters tend to be Biden's strength, along with people of color at the moment. So he's doing quite well in South Carolina, and he's doing quite well in Florida. And again, it's a reminder that the debate is in a week, and things can change. But, as well as Elizabeth Warren has been doing lately, Biden still has a pretty strong lead at this particular point in time as a snapshot.
Yeah. When is the debate? It's next week. What day?
I think it's Wednesday and Thursday, I think.
Okay. That's
remember,
going to be problematic for me. Okay.
Okay, so Sam Stein, writing about a very important aspect of this, which probably doesn't get covered enough.
Yes.
But before we do that, let's look at Morning Consult. Morning Consult has a new poll out on the Democratic race. And you may remember, Morning Consult does it interestingly. You can click on either Democratic primary voters overall or just the early primary state voters.
Okay.
Which one do you want to look at? First. We'll look at both, but which one first?
Yeah, well, there's an obvious answer at first. The early primary states, which are first.
Okay, let's do the first ones first. Joe Biden at 40.
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders 18. Elizabeth Warren 11. Buttigieg 7. Harris 5. Booker 4. Everybody else less.
Steve Bullock is on the screen.
1%.
Wow. Okay.
Now, Biden's at 40 in the early primary voters. When you look at the overall Democratic primary voters, Biden's at 38.
Okay, that's still a lot.
If you were expecting that Biden, he's going to do a lot worse in the early primary states, not according to this poll.
No, I wouldn't really have. I don't think I would have. Would I have thought that? You've been telling me not to think that, or haven't you?
Well, Iowa, where people are paying more attention and where the Democratic primary group is probably a bit more liberal than overall, Iowa's going to be a lot closer than this.
Okay.
But New Hampshire, maybe, I don't know. It'll depend a lot on Iowa. South Carolina and Florida, Nevada, looks like this for Biden. That's where his strength is coming from.
Okay. Well, I think the thing that changes is between early primary voters and Democratic primary voters is they swap out Steve Bullock for John Delaney.
Or maybe,
and Castro. Yeah. Well, it's pretty interesting. Okay, so the numbers are pretty consistent, though.
The numbers are pretty consistent.
For
but
Biden
here's
and
the thing,
Sanders
okay?
and Warren.
So this is a piece from Sam Stein.
Yes.
Exclusive poll reveals Dems' sexist problem in 2020. And I bring this up because it's a real thing. A full 20% of Democratic and independent men who responded to the survey said they agreed with the sentiment that women are less effective in politics than men.
Okay. Good
While
job,
74% of respondents claimed they were personally comfortable with a female president, only 33% believed their neighbors would be comfortable with a woman in the Oval Office.
That's
and
interesting.
that is a way to get around the I don't have any problems with voting for a black guy, but of course my neighbors would never do that.
My neighbors are very scared, very timid people.
Yeah, not me.
Right.
I'm bold, but they're all scared, and they're not going to do it.
I'll describe their intimidation in incredible detail, because we talk a lot.
Right. That latter number, explained Mallory Newell, research director at Ipsos, was a strong tell, it's an Ipsos poll, about how gender dynamics were souring voters on certain candidates. Asking respondents how they believe their neighbors feel about an issue is, quote, a classic method to get around people being reluctant to admit to less popular views.
Yes.
People will lie to you when they ask them about gender and race, said Michael Steele, RNC chair.
Oh, that one.
In Maryland. The guy that's on MSNBC all the time. The tall guy.
Okay.
Oh, black guy, if you're having trouble. Because there's two Michael Steeles. One of them used to be a spokesman for Boehner, and he's also an NBC alum.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, the NBC thing didn't help then. Okay, I think we got it.
Comfort that voters have with female candidates helps explain one of the persistent undercurrents of the current election. In various hypothetical general election matchups, the male Democratic candidates have consistently done better against Trump than the female counterparts. For example, Biden 56, Trump 44 in Emerson polling, Sanders 54, Trump 40, 52 to 48 for Buttigieg, 50-50 for Warren, and 51 Trump, 49 Harris.
Okay.
Right? And this was largely true in the Ipsos poll as well. Biden bested Trump by 46-35. Sanders beat Trump 47-35. By contrast, Elizabeth Warren beat Trump by 42-36. And Harris beat him by 41-35. So still winning. And that makes a dual argument. On the one hand, any Democrat should be seen as being electable. And on the other hand, the males have an advantage.
Well, they do, I guess, have an advantage because of the number of people who said that their neighbors are worried about voting for women. So, I mean, do they have an advantage?
Democrat
Yes.
independent voter
Should they?
39%
No.
said they believed a female candidate would have a harder time running against Trump than a male candidate would. A chunk of that sentiment appears to be drawn from lingering fear and stress from the 2016 election outcome. That's why I always refer to 2016 as the PTSD election. And that's why people say, well, the polls say that Trump is out by 72 points. He's behind. But remember 2016. Well, no. Remember 2018, actually.
Remember something, anyway, please.
Remember the main. The findings
I
provide
forgot
one of
about
the
that.
clearest illustrations to date of the difficulties that Warren, Harris, Klobuchar, and others have faced in trying to break through a field led so far by white male candidates. Talk about learning the wrong lesson, said Jen Palmieri. We've had 2 elections since Trump has been either on the ballot or been in office, and in one, a woman got 2 million more votes than he did. I think it was closer to 3 million. And in the midterms, women candidates won in historic numbers. So the only evidence we have shows that having women on the ballot in the Trump year is a good thing. It does motivate women. Women do vote. I think Democrats have a lot of trauma about the 2016 outcome. I've said that before.
Yeah, like seconds ago.
Yeah, and are suspicious that voters have an unease with women candidates, but the actual record shows a different story. Well, maybe. I'm not justifying it. I am pointing out it is still an issue. Now, this is an avalanche strategy poll on electability, which is a completely different poll than the Ipsos one.
Yes.
Making the same point. The electability gap is driven in large part by beliefs about how gender is perceived in America today. Those who see gender as a barrier to electability consistently express beliefs that other voters will not vote for a woman. These findings suggest that many voters may not need to be convinced the female candidate is more capable. They must be convinced that Americans are capable of electing them, which is a completely different approach. And that's why it's important to highlight that.
Right.
And that's why attacking this whole electability thing is a worthwhile venture for those who are supporting female candidates.
Yes, right. Does Elizabeth Warren have a plan for that?
I hope she does.
Because
Now,
that's the one that we need.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
97% of likely
That's
Democratic
most.
voters. That's a lot. That's like all Democrats for practical purposes.
Yeah.
Believe that beating Trump is very or extremely important. And only 28% are certain that Democrats will win.
Okay, that sounds democratic.
One of my big pet peeves that I always rant about is stop telling me that we can't take it for granted. Democrats never take anything for granted.
Yes.
It's a non-issue.
They just worry that it's not going to work.
Yes.
Okay.
But not that we have it in the bank. Trump has said, oh, well, you're just trying to dampen enthusiasm because you're saying that we don't have to do that. No, I'm just saying that Trump is ahead, Trump is behind, whatever it says.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't come with a secret message that your decoder ring will tell you when I'm really trying to whisper in your ear.
Yeah, I don't feel it that way either. I see a lot less of it, and I think people. It's interesting this time.
2018 helped a lot.
Yeah, and I think people are thinking when you tell me that Trump is behind all the Democratic candidates, I've never heard anybody say you're trying to dampen enthusiasm. Most people end up saying, "Great, I can't wait to grind his bones into dust. I'm going to vote so early. It's going to be great."
So when it comes to 2020, this avalanche study says likely Democratic voters are currently feeling emotions of determination and hope, but also frustration, overwhelm, and doubt.
Yes.
Because Trump is still president and it drives us nuts.
Yeah.
Whereas because he does things like concentration camps and baby jails.
No, you mean the other thing.
I mean concentration camps and baby jails. Whereas likely Republican voters are feeling relatively more excitement, pride, and happiness. That's because Trump is currently president and they feel like they've got 2016. It's like the Yankee fans, and I know many of them, including myself, whenever they lose to the Red Sox, say, yeah, well, what about the Mickey Mantle era?
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Pride, excitement, happiness. Yeah, we suck now. But, in those days, it was great. We're actually doing pretty well this year despite the injuries. But the point is that when you're winning, you feel excitement and pride about your team.
Yes.
And when you're losing, you find excuses and you have doubt and frustration and you blame the manager and you want to fire him.
Mm-hmm. All right. That all sounds real.
So, as a result, perceived electability is particularly salient for likely Democratic voters heading into 2020. And when perceived electability is removed from consideration, the Democratic primary tightens significantly. When choosing a preferred president absent consideration of electability, they use the magic wand. If you could wave a magic wand,
wow.
not worry about the election, and make somebody president, who would you prefer?
Yeah, that's a great, what a fun thing.
21% chose Warren, 19% chose Biden, 19% chose Sanders, 16 Buttigieg, 12 Harris, and 4% O'Rourke. That's a reasonable approach to trying to figure out where people stand, and I have to remind the doubters and the more progressive aspects of the Democratic Party that 19% for Biden doing just as well as Sanders and just a tad behind Warren means Biden has his own strength and it's not all smoke and mirrors.
I guess that is true. I'm surprised that people didn't continue to wave those magic wands and come up with different names, but
yeah, gender appears to have a greater effect on perceived electability than age, race, ideology, or sexual orientation. 19% of those who would make a female candidate president by the magic wand method believe that gender is a primary barrier. Among those who raise gender as an issue, 62% express beliefs American voters will not elect a woman.
So they like that magic wand.
Right. So
Their neighbors need
if
it.
you're talking about emotions associated with the 2020 election by party vote, Republicans and Democrats are tied on determination. Democrats are ahead on hope, frustration, anger, doubt, hopelessness, overwhelming. Neither one are particularly sad. Only GOP doesn't have strong feelings, and only the GOP is excited about this.
GOP
and only the
embarrassed by
GOP
feelings.
has pride on what's going on right now.
Yes, that's the only feeling they allow themselves to have.
Proud
Everything
Boys.
else
That's
is...
why they're called Proud Boys, right?
Yeah, I guess so. Maybe that's it. So they
Right.
had a pride march yesterday. That's
Yes, I
good.
hear.
That's progress.
So the horse race choice versus magic wand choice. If you're
Yes.
talking about the horse race, Biden wins by a lot.
Okay.
30 to less than 20 for Sanders, less than 20 for Warren. But I gave you the magic wand numbers, and pretty much everybody's tied.
Yeah.
Now, age is mentioned by only 5% of supporters of candidates over 65 years, suggesting it's not explicitly a primary concern. Ideology is mentioned by 8%. Sexual orientation is mentioned by 9% of supporters of Buttigieg. Race is mentioned by 7% of supporters of both white and candidates of color, showing that voters perceive challenges on both sides of this issue. Gender is mentioned by 19% of supporters of female candidates as a worry about an issue. And gender is mentioned by 24% of respondents who chose a male candidate in the horse race, but a female magic wand president, suggesting there's a heightened concern with gender among vote switchers there. In other words, those people who voted for Biden as their choice, but given the magic wand would have voted for Harris or Warren, are making the point that they're for Biden because they don't think a woman could win.
Well, I guess I'm glad. It's interesting. They're working overtime, these pollsters. What if you had a magic wand? What if your neighbor had a magic wand? What if... wow.
Right.
Huh.
What if all the people you didn't like in your town could be magically wanded into a concentration camp?
That's an idea, too.
I mean, look, the whole idea here is, again, I'm not advocating for voting for Biden because he's a male and don't vote for Warren because she can't win because she's a girl. You know, it's not the all little girl thing, pat on the head. The point is to know about it because, like you pointed out, this is one of those things Warren better have a plan for.
Yeah. Right. I know that's probably wasn't on the top of her list, but
it's not on the top of the list of things she wanted to have to do. But this is something she's going to have to do.
And it's not a public policy plan. And this is the one you would kind of keep to yourself for a while.
Now, interestingly, this is the interesting nuance here. Voters doubt the ability of American voters to elect a woman. They don't doubt the capability of the candidate.
Okay. Like, I tried to fill in that box. I just couldn't, or...
Right. It's not that we don't think Elizabeth Warren could do the job. We're just worried people won't vote for her. That's a very different task than convincing people that you could do the job.
Yeah. Huh. Complex.
But at least you need to know what the task is.
Yeah,
so, that's what's going on.
Something's hiding still beneath this. Despite the digging that the pollsters are doing, they're going to have to really... it's interesting that they're parsing this, and there's more to do, and I think they're making some interesting inroads here.
Right. And by the way, I just looked down in the methodology question, just so you know, and Avalanche, which is doing listening polls, is combining with Civics, which polls for Daily Kos, Full disclosure there. And civics are providing the panel and doing the raw data collection and weighting.
Is the listening poll the new focus group? Is that what that is?
Yeah, pretty much. It's a focus group style of concentrate on what I'm saying here.
Yes.
So it's a focus group method of trying to get what people think.
Right, but everyone hates focus groups, so it's a
listening poll, right?
Okay. I'm going on a focus group tour.
Yeah, I mean, if you're really interested, they call it psychographic listening. It's like Harry Seldon for politics.
I guess so. Wow, the little Cambridge Analytica-y there. But okay.
The best way to understand what people think is to ask and listen. Just imagine what you would know and what you could do if you could have a conversation with every person you want to reach.
Yeah, I have to listen to your neighbor apparently, but okay.
Right. We start by prompting a representative sample of your target community to respond to open-ended questions. Then they do a survey online. Then they can be delivered via panel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's
delivered via panel. Okay, that's
right. And civics does the
dehumanizing. I gotcha.
All right, so that's basically my segment. And in the last couple of minutes, I just wanted to throw in something from last week that we were talking about that I finally got my hands on.
All right, waving the wand. Go ahead.
And that's by Josh Hooter, who's a Georgetown Congress nerd. And he's talking about, remember back in the day, when the Hyde Amendment came up for discussion.
Right.
And it came up in front of the Rules Committee, and the Rules Committee said, I know it's a hot topic because Joe Biden just changed his mind and now you want to get rid of the Hyde Amendment, but you can't do that because the rules say you can't.
Oh, that one. Yes.
Right? So just for you process people, which includes me,
yes,
because I'm always learning. I don't know this stuff like David does.
I saved
this was just a really, really interesting discussion of when you have the gavel, you make the rules. Okay? So it'll be short. It'll take you through 10 o'clock, and then you can decide what you want to do for the rest of the show.
Yes.
Is Joan on today?
No, Joan is invading France today.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So, Josh Hooter says, a perfect illustration of presidential politics affecting congressional negotiations. Biden took a controversial stance on the Hyde Amendment. Now, progressive lawmakers have filed language to strike it from the law, setting up an enormous appropriations fight in a critical budget year.
Yes.
You can see leadership trying to head this off. The language would technically be against House rules. A staffer says, if the proposal creating new coverage requirements were allowed, it would be in violation of House rules and subject to a point of order against its consideration since it would constitute legislating on an appropriations bill.
Yes.
The Rules Committee will meet Monday and Tuesday to determine what amendments are in order for the floor debate on the 5-bill package. So that's how they decided. It's actually House Rule XXI, House Rule 21.
Right. Thank you for using Roman numerals.
Yeah, so you can't
Not
do that.
Sharia numbers.
But, Hooter says, this doesn't actually apply in most cases. That's the thing. The Rules Committee dictates which amendments are in order. Once it decides which amendments will be debated, it procedurally protects those amendments from House rules. So whether an amendment violates House rules is irrelevant unless leaders want an excuse to prevent the amendment in the first place. In the quote above, leadership staff are laying the groundwork to reject the amendment. That amendment violates House rules, therefore cannot be okayed by the Rules Committee to go to the floor. And in theory, this is accurate, but in practice, it's nonsense. Because in every circumstance today, the Rules Committee ensures House rules are irrelevant to floor debate. If the Rules Committee didn't want House rules to prevent this amendment, they wouldn't.
True.
This speaks to how the institutional rules impact political negotiations behind the scenes. Leaders leverage their institutional knowledge and power to affect the politics of policies. Nothing wrong with that. That's why you want an experienced leader. That was part of the rationale behind Nancy Pelosi and no one else, because she knows the rules.
Yes.
In this case, progressives' amendment went too far. Leaders can claim it's a violation, which it is. Leaders can present this strong argument to the caucus justifying their decision to strike it, which is an action possible because of other institutional powers. In short, overlapping rules and powers enable leaders to influence debate and politics. Now, progressives would have been on stronger procedural footing to strike Hyde had they not included additional language. This would not have guaranteed the coverage they sought, but leadership would not have been able to cast the decide and manipulate its politics. So institutions constrain policy. What is politically possible is limited by power. Here, progressives' best procedural argument limits policy provisions they can offer without leadership acquiescence. But if they do that, they won't get what they want exactly. Okay. Now,
Yes.
of course, leaders may be leaning on Rule 21 as covers others in the caucus avoid the vote. They may not want this vote fight given it's very dead in the Senate, and that eliminates another unknown. Progressives may have intentionally added language ensuring its defeat to prohibit its consideration so that they wouldn't lose in the Senate.
Yes.
That happens. Regardless, it's an interesting interaction highlighting the interplay between politics and institutions. I thought that was fascinating. I couldn't find it on the day that we were discussing it, but I thought it was a great example of how if you have the gavel, you can do whatever the hell you want, and you can probably justify it.
Yes, it is, and it's a great example. And I think I will examine that a little bit more because I think there's some extra explaining that will need to go on. I saved that one. I remember you sent that one last week, and I said on Friday, be a good day to go through this, but I'm going to wait until Greg gets back here because this is his find here. But now that I read through it, I realize it probably requires an extra 15 minutes of explanation of some of the things at each one of these steps. So, yeah, I would like to spend more time on that. I will.
Okay, well, put it aside in pocket so you could not find it on a later day.
Right, I'm leaving it here open.
Right, and then I'll leave you with one think piece in case you want to do that.
Oh, no. Yes.
And that's by Thomas Edsall. And it's called Trump is Changing the Shape of the Democratic Party, too. Okay. In reaction to his provocations, many white Democrats are seeing race relations in a new light.
They are saying this?
Yeah.
Okay.
While Trump did turn out the universe of voters who score high in measures of racial resentment and what political scientists call anti-black effect, he also generated a boomerang effect. A groundswell of hostility on the political left to Trump's rhetoric and policy initiatives gained strength as Trump moved from the periphery of the American politics to the Oval Office. So for every action, there's a reaction. It's a good summary of all of that.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to have the opportunity to read what Tom Edsall has to say in the New York Times because somehow along the way I got blocked by him on Twitter. So I guess I'll have to turn to the New York Times to find out what he's thinking.
Great.
Maybe not about that. Thanks, Greg.
All right.
I appreciate it. Good setup for you
tomorrow.
The second
Maybe
hour.
We'll do whatever we didn't do today.
All right. We can do that. Or we can do it all over again. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. It's time, everybody. It's time to go. I gotta bring this thing back up. I kind of wish we had done this earlier because I'm sure Greg would like to have sat through some more of the discussion on this one. It's very clear to me, and I guess to Greg, what Josh Hooter, and it's H-U-D-E-R, by the way. It does sound like Hooter, H-O-O-T-E-R. It's H-U-D-E-R, and well, it's very clear what he's saying, and he gives a very detailed explanation of it, but this is one of those things where on Twitter, and perhaps even in print elsewhere where you're limited by the amount of space you can give over to the topic, I think there's a couple of assumptions that are built into it. It's writing for people who follow process and have had these discussions before, and I don't know that there are definitely little parts of it, like with the take care clause discussion the other day, actually the Monday discussion. I felt like afterwards, there's some additional context that was necessary before we really discussed that, just so it would make some more sense. And it's sometimes difficult to keep track of how much background information you've given or things that occur to you while you're reading a piece that are either taken for granted or do require some additional discussion, but then the discussion either should have taken place beforehand or is a distraction from reading this very highly concentrated, a concentrated encampment of these dense but valuable thoughts on procedure. Let me start over on this one and give you the thoughts that I thought ought to be appended to what Josh Hooter says. So as he began, right, this is a perfect illustration of presidential politics affecting congressional negotiations. Okay, sure. Biden took a controversial stance on the Hyde Amendment. And really, here, Biden's stance on it only highlights the issue that there is a Hyde Amendment and it ought to be gotten rid of. But his position doesn't really have very much to do necessarily with what's going on inside the House on this one. But okay. In other words, the Hyde Amendment is in the news generally because he took a controversial stance on it and then reversed himself. Now, he was asked to take a stance on it because it was already in the news, because members of the House are trying to rid themselves rightly of the Hyde Amendment. But involving presidential candidates, and particularly in this case Biden, only served to inflame the issue. So now progressive lawmakers, and they were doing it even beforehand, have filed language to strike it from law, get rid of the Hyde Amendment. We all know what the Hyde Amendment is, right? It's a prohibition on the use of federal funds for abortion. And, okay, so now progressive lawmakers have filed language to strike it from law. It ended up getting codified at some point. It used to be, originally, it was designed as a tool for the anti-choice Republican right to bring up every year as a rallying point for their anti-abortion sentiment. A prohibition on the use of federal funds for abortion is something that you can, when you're offering it as an amendment to an appropriations bill, in order to do it prospectively, is not legislating in an appropriations bill, but falls into the category of the permissible limiting or limitations amendment. The limiting amendment that simply states none of the funds allocated or appropriated in this bill, for whatever purposes, may be used for the purposes of paying for an abortion. And I mean, it's legislating in the sense that you're limiting the ability of of people to use the dollars for certain purposes. But these limiting amendments are generally considered as acceptable under normal House rules. But it was a tool for the anti-choice right for a number of reasons, not the least of which was that you certainly could have tried to codify that earlier, but I think the point of the Hyde Amendment was that it could be offered every year on every appropriations bill. So it was of more PR value as a standalone amendment that got added to every single appropriations bill. And though it would have achieved their purpose more effectively to have codified it earlier so they wouldn't have to continue to do the same work over and over again, there was a conscious decision not to do it that way. And that's the reason why. The Hyde Amendment getting added permanently to law covering all appropriations bills from this point going forward is boring. It got coverage for a couple of days while it's debated, and once it's passed, maybe even for a little while longer because it's controversial. Maybe a court case comes up about it and it comes back into the news. But offering it 12 times a year is a much bigger PR win than offering it once for all time, right? So, and in other words, and why offer it on every bill? I mean, for instance, does the science, space, and technology, appropriations, whatever it is, for NASA appropriations, the bills for, pick your obscure agriculture appropriations bill. Is that an appropriate amendment for the agriculture appropriations bill? No, ordinarily not, right? But the argument would always go, well, do you care about killing babies or not? And of course, if you're Henry Hyde and if you're taking that to a Republican Rules Committee, it's a no-brainer for them. Of course, they want to have that issue raised on the floor. If you're taking it to a Democratic Rules Committee, you get the opposite of coherent treatment, generally speaking. You get some who say, well, I want to protect members from this stupid and unnecessary vote. And you get others who say, well, gee whiz, why don't we just defeat it on the floor? We should remain open to this sort of thing. Or I have swing folks in my district who want us to be sensitive to abortion and who want us to keep it legal, but insist that I take the position that it be safe, legal, and rare, right? That wave of Democratic electioneering led us to the point where Henry Hyde made his amendment famous by offering it 12 and at some points during this period of time 13 times a year on the various appropriations bills. Of course, they were sometimes compounded into omnibus appropriations bills, so there weren't as many opportunities. But the point is that annually you could count on having a hot debate over abortion on the House floor and therefore on TV via C-SPAN under the name the Hyde Amendment, and it was good PR to do it that way. Eventually, though, they ended up codifying it, and I think, if I recall correctly, there was some discussion at that point, even among Democrats, thinking, maybe strategically it would be a wise thing to go along with codifying the Hyde Amendment, though I oppose the substance of the Hyde Amendment, in that it would eliminate this PR tool. There wouldn't have to be anywhere from 1 to 13 individual debates over the Hyde Amendment annually. It would just sort of be there and then go away. Now, the downside of that strategically is that undoing the codification in an appropriations bill is difficult, if not impossible, under the House rules to do, depending on how seriously you take the House rules. So that's where we are for the beginning of this discussion. Background on the Hyde Amendment, how it got there, how it came to be codified, how you could even possibly see Democrats who were legitimately opposed to the substance of the Hyde Amendment nonetheless acquiescing to its codification. I don't know if people actually made decisions based on that or not. There's too many people for me to review the history of, 250 some odd Democrats, some of whom have long since retired or even passed away. So, but as I recall, that was an issue out there. So now back to the beginning of Josh Hooter's thing. So, Biden took a controversial stance on the Hyde Amendment. Now progressive lawmakers have filed language to strike it from law. It was important to tell you why it's in law in the first place. Setting up an enormous appropriations fight in a critical budget year. Really, an enormous appropriations fight in any year is a pretty big deal. Is this a critical budget year? Maybe. I don't really know why. I don't know that I would classify it as critical, more critical than any other particular year, except for the fact that there's an incompetent president and an incompetent minority party in the House that happens to be the majority party in the Senate, and they're never going to get their act together, so we're going to be looking at shutdowns again. So I guess in that sense, it's a critical budget year. Anyway, moving on here. You know what? I wonder if, let me take a look at the article that he includes, or, it's a CQ article, so I can't get to it. So good, that saves us some problems. I was wondering whether that would make a good background read in terms of how we got to the point of codifying the Hyde language. Anyway, moving on in Josh's tweet thread here, you can see leadership trying to head this off. Here's what's happening. Yes, the language would technically be against House rules, and we'll explain why. And the way this particular amendment is constructed, it would be authorizing language on an appropriations bill, a big no-no under House Rule 21. That's Roman numeral 21. And he's got a little screenshot here that reads, it's appended to his tweet, if the proposal creating new coverage requirements were allowed. See, I guess that's an important part of this too. What exactly is it that progressive members are proposing? And apparently an amendment to an appropriations bill that would create new coverage requirements. I guess through the Affordable Care Act, perhaps, for instance, requiring coverage for abortion services despite the codification of the Hyde Amendment that would otherwise prohibit it. Okay, so to do that would, of course, be legislating in an appropriations bill, making a new law that says, whether it's the Affordable Care Act or any other private insurance, or maybe it's even one of the public insurance programs, but allowing or requiring that abortion services be covered would require a new law, and to put it's against House rules typically, as they say, to legislate in an appropriations bill. An appropriations bill is supposed to be a list of programs and how much money they're getting. That's it. And though it's permissible to impose limitations, either specifically or generally across an entire appropriations bill, none of the money in this bill shall be used for this purpose. It is too far beyond the rules, the standing rules, the way they are written, to say, for instance, something like there should be a new program created and it should be funded this much, or even further beyond just the fact that this is a new program that should be created and these are the things that should from here on in be permissible under the law, and here are the things that should be illegal under the law. Those should be handled in regular legislation, authorizing legislation, as they say. That I guess the House rule is written this way for the purpose of trying to declutter an already cluttered kind of bill. Appropriations bills are Byzantine and huge and long and stultifying, and it's very difficult to get through them. And in the public interest, combing through them to see how public money is spent is a very, very, very tedious task. And it's an awfully devious thing. Too devious, in fact, for members of the United States House of Representatives, generally speaking, to allow members to bury obscure provisions that really require open debate and the full consideration, full attention of the House concentrated on them so that you can actually make good policy. Burying them in an appropriations bill is a good way to hide them. And, of course, the rule, I think, probably has its genesis in early on discovering, one, how necessary appropriations bills are. Remember that there's government shutdown if you don't pass your appropriations bills. And whether all of them or just one of them, if you don't pass one of them, that department that is funded in that bill gets shut down until one passes. So in that sense, they are considered must-pass bills. This is must-pass legislation. There'll be a shutdown if you don't pass this thing. And those aren't the circumstances under which members of the House fairly, usually, think it would be fair to do extraneous legislation. This thing has to pass, so I'll stick my controversial provision on there that would never pass the House freestanding, but you could probably, even if you were going to say a freestanding bill on it, would lose by 10 votes. Let's say it's a close call. Could I peel off 10 people who say, I really, really strongly disagree with this one provision of this bill, but if I vote no because of this provision, this department will shut down, or possibly this entire government, if you have compiled everything into an omnibus bill. I can't justify a government shutdown or partial government shutdown based on my objection to this provision. That's extraordinarily unfair and overbearing use of the leverage of these must-pass bills. So that's why the rule against legislating or authorizing in an appropriations bill exists. Legislating, using the term legislating in an appropriations bill, that's much more understandable. Authorizing is generally what normal legislation does, but just to explain what that's about, we've sort of bifurcated the spending process in this country and in this way. First up, of course, are the authorizing bills. For instance, if you're spending money on space exploration, then the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, I don't even know if that committee exists in that form anymore. They change the name of these committees all the time. But whatever committee name is now that handles these things, I'm not up on that anymore. You want to spend money on space exploration, the Science, Space, and Technology Committee would be the one that says, all right, we hereby authorize a $1 trillion mission to Mars. just in the most general terms. It would then be the responsibility later on, just so that too much power isn't concentrated in any one place, it would be the responsibility of the appropriate subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee, as distinct from the Science, Space, and Technology Committee. The Appropriations Committee has a subcommittee which includes in its jurisdiction somewhere a number of different departments and certain independent agencies, including, for this purposes, NASA. The Appropriations Committee receives essentially the okay from the Authorizing Committee, Science, Space, and Technology. They say, we authorize up to $1 trillion to be spent on a mission to Mars. And at that point, does NASA have $1 million? No, it does not. NASA gets, or $1 trillion. NASA gets $1 trillion when the Appropriations Committee says, we hereby appropriate, subject to and at the direction of the authorizing language from Science, Space, and Technology Committee, which authorized up to $1 trillion, we hereby appropriate that $1 trillion, or we hereby appropriate 1 billion of that $1 trillion, or whatever they choose to do. It splits the responsibility so that there isn't one committee somewhere that can just say, I say there's $1 trillion program, boom, that's it. It has to clear a number of hurdles in order to get that $1 trillion. That's how we control the purse strings in this country. And it's why we have a rule like that. If we're going to go through the trouble of saying one group of people has to authorize it, another group of people have to appropriate money for it, and the whole House has to ratify both actions, and hey, so does the Senate, and then, and only then, does the money get spent. You'd think we would have a much lower budget deficit this way, but it actually works contrary to the way you would think. Because there's so many moving pieces here and so much leverage, cross-leverage to be used here. But that's a discussion for another day. Right? So we have these two parts of the responsibility of spending money. If we allowed appropriators generally to legislate in their appropriations bills, then there would be either no need for, or you would seriously undermine the authority of all the other authorizing committees. At all of the rest of Congress, at their expense, they would lose power to the X number of people who manage to make it to the Appropriations Committee, and they have power enough as it is. So the ruling is, all right, you have to, in order to get project funded in this country, one group of people have to do the authorizing, another has to do the appropriating, and if we allow one group to do both, that's problematic, so let's make a rule against it. That's where we now are. If the proposal creating new coverage requirements here in terms of payment for abortion, if you were allowed to do that, it would be in violation of those rules, and for all the reasons we described that we have those rules. Be a violation of House rules and subject to a point of order against its consideration. What does it mean to say it's against the rules to legislate in an appropriations bill? What if you have a Donald Trump type person who's on the Appropriations Committee and they're the chair, and they say, to hell with it, I'm going to put legislative language in an appropriations bill anyway because I know it's a must pass and I want to use that leverage. It says you're not allowed to, but you and what army? What are they going to do to stop me? Well, the answer is a point of order would be recognized against that language. You could go, when the appropriations bill gets to the House floor, any member could rise and say, I raise a point of order against this provision of the bill. It violates House rules. And at that point, you're kind of totally exposed. And the House, if it's offended by this violation of the rules, could vote by majority vote to uphold the point of order and strike it from the bill. There's a little procedure that goes along with how that vote is called, etc. But to boil it down to its most essential, any member can say, that is a violation of the rules. And it can happen with any of the violations of the rules. This one you see a lot of. This is legislating an appropriations bill, and I invoke a point of order against it, and we'll have a vote on whether or not to expunge this provision from the bill before we go forward. Now, there are all sorts of counter leverages people can use to protect the bill ahead of time, or you could, of course, raise a point of order against the bill and find that a majority of the House, for whatever reason, says, we're not bothered by that. They can say, yeah, it's a violation of the rules, but we're okaying it in this instance. Or they could say, we think you have it wrong. It is not a violation of the rules. Either way, a majority will do it. Another way to handle it, but to avoid that situation on the floor, is the Rules Committee can write a rule for the consideration of these bills. Everyone remembers this, right? Every bill that comes to the floor, pretty much every bill that comes to the floor, comes with its own rule outlining the terms of the debate, right? And one of the things you can do, one of the things you normally do in there is to say, this bill will be debatable for 6 hours. And that's the most basic sort of rule. Why do you have a rule like that? And the answer is because absent something like that, the standing House rules, the same ones that so wisely advise us not to mix our appropriating and our legislating, the rules generally say all bills will be debatable for 1 hour. Well, that's not often enough time for 1 hour, but that's for any bill, but that's the default rule. So one of the annoying things you have to do as part of the Rules Committee is you say, we might have to write a new special rule for this one. We're going to need 6 hours on this one. And if we don't go through this exercise, we're going to be limited by the standing rules to 1 hour, and we don't want that. One of the more esoteric and somewhat sneakier things that the Rules Committee can do is that they can say, not only are we going to debate this thing for 6 hours, but there's this one provision in here that is pretty obviously a violation of the House rules. It is legislating in an appropriations bill, and it would be subject to a point of order that a majority vote could then excise from the bill, and we don't want that to happen. And we're the Rules Committee, and we're very important people. How do you get on the Rules Committee? You got to be pretty loyal to the leadership, the Speaker, and the rest of the members of the Steering and Policy Committee that make committee assignments. You got to be a pretty reliable party vote to get on there. And the party ratio on the Rules Committee is very heavily weighted towards the majority. They want to be able to do what they need to do. There are minority members there. Their job is to harass you and embarrass you and into realizing that you're breaking the House rules. And your job is to grin and swallow hard and do what you're instructed to do by the majority leadership. So they can do things like, yes, this is a violation of the rules, and yes, it would probably even lose in a straight up vote on whether or not it should be expunged from the bill. So we propose a rule that allows for 6 hours of debate plus a special provision that says this particular provision is exempt from a point of order on the floor. And then you send that rule in the form of a resolution to the floor ahead of the bill with the controversial provision, and you put it to your majority and say, listen, if you don't vote for this rule, we lose control. The majority loses control, at least temporarily, of the House floor here. We don't get to bring our very important must-pass bill to the floor under conditions most favorable to its passage. It is a great heresy, in most cases, not to vote for the rule for a bill if you are a part of the majority party. And they used that leverage to get this special rule passed that says 6 hours of debate, that seems normal, plus no points of order against this difficult provision. That's a weird departure, but it's a fairly common departure. And so that's how you would protect something like this if you wanted to, right? And in this case, it turns out they just didn't want to. So here we are. If the proposal creating the new coverage of abortion requirements were allowed, it would be in violation of House rules and subject to a point of order against its consideration, since it would constitute legislating in an appropriations bill. The Rules Committee will meet Monday and Tuesday, and I guess that was yesterday and the day before, to determine what amendments are in order for the floor debate on the 5-bill package. This is something that happens all the time, and that means that the Rules Committee had a chance to exempt this thing if it wanted to. It just didn't. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, with a brand new interruption to say thanks to all of you who support the show. Remember when I told you that our average monthly donation was about $7, for which you were getting 2 great hours of news and entertainment 5 days a week, and how that came out to about 70 cents an hour? That's a pretty good deal, except it's wrong. The math actually works out closer to 17 cents an hour. It is hard to beat a deal like that, and even harder to send your kids to college on. Thankfully, Patreon.com makes it easy to make that work. Patreon, Patreon.com, is the simple, secure way to make recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Just search for me or the show name on the site, and they make it easy to crowdfund the show so that the power of our numbers can keep the show going for just a few bucks a month. Once again, thanks so much for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Okay, I know, we're getting deep into the weeds of this thing and not making any progress on it. I'm hopeful that most of you understand this already, but that I'm not boring you to death by over-explaining it. However, I think you really, if you don't understand it innately, we ought to be brought along on this subject. So basically what we've got here is a situation in which the Rules Committee could, if it wanted to, protect this legislating in an appropriations bill in order to give the House an opportunity to vote to undo the codification of the Hyde Amendment permanently. And that sounds like the sort of thing that a Democratic majority would want to do. Right? And I think that the majority of Democrats probably do want to do it, although you can never tell entirely, and I guess anything's possible given that Biden wasn't 100% clear on what he wanted to do with it. And if Biden's not, and here he is leading the nomination race for the time being anyway, you can imagine that there are probably a number of House Democrats who likewise are reluctant for various reasons. And not all of the reasons are the same. But I mean, like I said, like I've said a number of times, the vote has to be a yes or a no either way, no matter what your reasons are. And all you count is the yeses or nos, and the yes coalition means this thing happens, and the no coalition means it doesn't, and it doesn't matter what your reasons for it were. Okay, so why would they be trying to head it off? There's a number of reasons. It could be that they don't want to create this particular controversy at this particular time. It could be that they'd prefer to see standalone legislation repealing the codification of the Hyde Amendment all by itself for messaging reasons, for reasons of cleanliness and adhering to House rules and regular order, for reasons of setting up the Senate to reject it. It could be anything. Or it could be a residual feeling that may or may not be a part of Biden's calculations on all of this, that there was at one point some Democratic thinking that thought we were better off codifying the Hyde Amendment, but they've forgotten the particular reasons why they were okay with it at the time. It might have been a bad choice, but if at the time you were one of the people that said, I just want this headache to go away, the Republicans have engineered this opportunity to vote on this thing 12 times a year, I want that gone, and I can't find any other way other than codifying this thing. And since, substantively speaking, we were at a place in political space-time back then where the only likely outcome was, in fact, a vote to codify this thing and to prohibit the use of federal funds for abortion, and no other political outcome was imaginable despite the vocal opposition of a minority. So let's just go and do ourselves a favor and get rid of this particular headache. Remember where we were politically at the time, and remember also that there were abortion advocates, abortion rights advocates, who even if they didn't agree necessarily with the calculation that codifying this thing at long last would at least remove this headache, they might have instead thought, well, let's remove this particular obstacle from the path to passage of the Affordable Care Act. Remember, that was a huge sticking point in the Affordable Care Act, and there were supposedly pro-life Democrats who would otherwise have to be counted on in their support for the overall ACA because the vote was close. The country was divided, having been lobbied incessantly by some disingenuous Republicans with what has now become a familiar refrain. It's all socialisms, and we got to get rid of it. You remember what the lobbying against it was like, and the rise of the Tea Party, which was just a precursor to the insanity of the Trump years, which was always a part of the Republican Constitution, small c, as we know, but it was there. And there were Democratic leaders, strongly pro-choice Democratic leaders, central to their own small c constitutions, but who also thought, there's just so much that has to be done in terms of providing so many kinds of health care to so many people in this country. The Affordable Care Act is such a significant, it's a BFD, as that guy, Joe Biden, who started the discussion, had to say, right? And so were there members who were totally committed to pro-choice ideology, who nonetheless said, the ACA is so important, I will set this objection aside for now and will come back and revisit it? Yes, there were. Are they trying to revisit it now? Some of them are, yes. Some of them are gone. Some of them are trying to revisit it now. Others are saying, this is not the way in which to revisit it, but I'd like to. There's any number of reasons out there. So, okay. Here we are. And Josh is giving us the reminder that this is a choice, right? So you can see the leadership, for whatever reasons, deciding that they want to head off this particular fight at this particular time. And so they rely on the rules. And then Josh continues, this rule against breaking the rules doesn't apply in most cases. The Rules Committee dictates which amendments are in order. Once it decides which amendments will be debated, it procedurally protects those amendments from House rules. So whether an amendment violates the House rules is irrelevant unless leaders want an excuse to prevent the amendment in the first place. Right? So if I guess the screen grab that we had read about if the proposal creating new coverage requirements were allowed is a quote from a leadership staffer saying, laying the groundwork to reject the amendment. The amendment violates House rules, therefore it cannot be okayed by the Rules Committee to go to the floor. So interesting. So now pausing at this point. The Rules Committee gets to say what amendments are in and what amendments are out. If you want to amend a bill that's coming to the floor, that is the procedure, by the way. That's how you do it. You can't just under normal House, this is interesting. Under normal House rules, you can just show up with an amendment and say, I've got an amendment at the desk and we need to debate it. It's wide open. Of course, those are the rules under which you are only allowed to debate the thing for 1 hour. And we don't use those rules, those default rules, very often because the Rules Committee is created to give us more freedom to debate these things even more openly for 6 hours, right? But also to restrict what's going on in the debate. The upshot of having the Rules Committee is that if you have an amendment that you want considered on thus and such a bill, you need to make sure that that amendment is going to be in order for consideration. And that means you have to go to the people who are writing the special rule for the consideration of this bill and say, would you please include on your list of amendments that are in order, because the rules very explicitly, the special rules that the Rules Committee writes will very explicitly say in most instances, anything not listed herein is presumptively out of order. So that if you do try to show up on the floor and say, I have an amendment at the desk, they say, it's not listed here, so the rule says it's out of order. So what it means is, if you've got an amendment to a bill, you have to go begging to the Rules Committee. You got to go and you show up for the hearing on the rule for the bill, which is usually at night, by the way, and sit around waiting for your turn to beg the Rules Committee to let your amendment in. And you got to convince those people who are on the majority side, majority leadership loyalists, and on the minority side, typically minority side leadership loyalists as well. And you got to pitch them on this thing. I want to bring an amendment that will undo the codification of the Hyde Amendment, or I guess more narrowly speaking, that will mandate that abortion services be covered under thus and such an act, Affordable Care Act, Medicare Act, what have you. Maybe all of them, right? I don't know what the amendment itself actually says. But you got to go there and convince the Rules Committee to protect it. And they can be prevailed upon by the leadership to say, as much as you might agree with this, substantively, I need you to say no for reasons. They may explain their reasons, they may not. Depends what it takes to keep your relationship strong. If you're the kind of person who can take orders and not require an explanation because you trust the leadership, then fine. If you're the kind of person who generally trusts the leadership but requires knowing what's going on, then you'll get your little briefing. Just so long as you do what we ask you to do. So in most cases, in most bills, not just appropriations bills, not just ones that deal with controversial things, not just ones that deal with abortion, the Rules Committee goes through this exercise. If there is an agriculture bill to create a new law outlawing human-animal hybrids, because George W. Bush wanted it to happen, there will be a hearing in the Rules Committee the day before that bill is scheduled to come to the floor, where everybody who wants to say, well, I want to exempt human-rabbit hybrids from this ban, in my amendment will do that. Can I bring it to the floor tomorrow? And they'll say, no, you can't, or yes, you can. And it will be debated for 13 and a half minutes exactly. They can do whatever they want with it. Because, and why does the Rules Committee have this power? Why should anybody have power like that? Well, they've got it. They've got the power to draft the thing. But remember, ultimately, the rule that they draft has to be adopted by the House of Representatives. A majority in the House have to go there and vote for it. So it might have a ludicrous provision in it that makes no sense whatsoever. If it literally makes no sense to enough members and hurts them politically enough that they're willing to stand up and tell the leadership, no, I won't accept this stupid compromise, the rule fails. That's a big deal, and it almost never happens. But ultimately, the House of Representatives is given a chance to vote openly on, will you take the rule as proposed by the Rules Committee or will you not? And lots of people have lots of reasons for saying yes, and lots of people will have lots of reasons for saying no. But if ultimately they do say yes, then the House of Representatives has, as a matter of majority vote, agreed to accept a rule which allows 13 and a half minutes for the amendment to exempt from the ban human-rabbit hybrids. Stupid. Try to debate it for 14 minutes. You're out of order. I mean, sometimes they'll let you get away with that. But 13 and a half minutes, as dumb as that number is, that will be the rule for the debate of this bill. Not because the Rules Committee said so much as because the House, for whatever reason, was persuaded to go along with ratifying the rule as written by the Rules Committee. Why would members of the House do that? Hey man, I know the Rules Committee only does this because the leadership says that it should. And we all trust that Nancy Pelosi knows how to play these cards, so that's what we're going to do. I feel bad about it, but hey, if it worries you, don't let it bother you that much, because the reality is, older members will tell you, there is no way in the world that most people, or even any significant number of people in your district, are ever going to sit through an entire hour's explanation of how this crap works, such that they'll come away with enough of an understanding to A, legitimately and coherently oppose you, and B, convince anyone else to go along with them in their opposition to you. It's too obscure. It's too dense. No one cares. Besides which, there's an excuse. Nancy Pelosi says, I know what you mean substantively, but procedurally, politically, right now, no. Because we're going to do it later in a different way. And she's built an awful lot of goodwill out there among good, active, and vocal and persuasive Democrats, such that she'll be able to get the benefit of the doubt most times. That's what underlies all of this, and it's important to know. So, in this instance, though, there's another thing going on, and that highlights one of the downsides of Nancy Pelosi. Just to switch gears for a second and remind everybody of the annoying and sensitive impeachment question. And by the way, there's some breaking news on that front in terms of what Pelosi is willing to discuss on that front. Yes, as it turns out, for instance, I just saw The Hill tweeting this just in. Pelosi shoots down censuring Trump, saying apparently, and this is just their tweet, so I haven't read the substance of the context, if the goods are there, you must impeach. So do you want to interpret that as a pro-impeachment statement? She would probably deny that it is one, but it's out there. But at any rate, I only bring up the impeachment thinking in order to make this point. The other day, we discussed in great detail why I considered it to be, for instance, bullying, in a sense, when Nancy Pelosi told members of the public and other members of the House of Representatives things like, well, if you started an impeachment inquiry, it would be only the Judiciary Committee handling that inquiry, and all other committee probes of the president would have to shut down. And that's not true, and there's no reason to believe it. It should be true. And it even had that weird shaming element to it of, are you going to tell Elijah Cummings, this finally, at long last, powerful black voice in the Congress, that he has to pack up and go home in order to hand things over to the, well, she didn't say so, but the very obviously white Jerry Nadler? Well, you know, that's going to work on some people. But I considered it to be bullying because it was the sort of thing that sounded like it might technically be true, but be beyond the procedural comprehension of most people. So for the sake of not going crazy, digging into the weeds on every single thing, you just simply defer to Nancy Pelosi, who should, by all rights, know exactly what she's talking about on this front. And you believe it, and you grow quiet, and you go away. A mission accomplished for Nancy Pelosi, but not for you. You didn't learn anything. That's a bad thing. Similarly here, for the House Rules Committee to tell members of the public, members of the House who don't know better, particularly new members of the House, well, you see, it's not that I don't agree with you on the substance. It's not that I also don't think that the Hyde Amendment should be repealed. And it's not even that I'm not going to try to repeal it at some later date. But as much as I'd like to do this with you right now, do you see that it violates the House rules? I'm the Speaker of the House. I can't be about violating the House rules. That's crazy. What would I be any better than Trump if I was just willy-nilly violating the House rules? But as Josh is pointing out here, it's so common that it's not even considered a violation of the House rules to do things like this. As a matter of fact, I mean, the fact that you have special rules at all, even if you don't make any strange exceptions for amendments, or you have what they call an open rule, the rare and elusive now open rule for consideration of anything on the House floor, where they simply say it will be debatable for 6 hours, Or if they want, they can say it'll be infinitely debatable. Oh, that would create a House filibuster. How would you like that? That'd be interesting. But there's no reason why anybody would want to do that. But if you say it's open for debate for 6 hours and there's no recommendation whatsoever about amendments in this special rule, this resolution with the special rule for consideration of Bill X, that's an open rule. The only rule is that there's 6 hours to do it, and the Rules Committee will not pick and choose ahead of time or at any given time, at any point at all, which amendments will be allowable. It's just straight up, bring it to the floor, have it read, debate it, and have a vote. Those things don't happen very often anymore because it's ceding control to the other side typically, which then takes advantage of open rules and brings trolling amendments along the lines of the ones we see offered very often as motions to recommit these days. Get into that discussion another time, perhaps. But they can do that with the rules. But even if they did that, I mean, technically speaking, what did I tell you the House rule was on how long a bill could be debated? The answer is 1 hour. This resolution says that this bill can be debated for 6 hours. Or whatever, 2 hours. Carmine said 1 hour. Here are 2. There's a reference for you. The House rules say 1 hour of debate. To allow 6 hours of debate is a violation of House rules. I can't be violating the House rules if I'm the Speaker of the House. How would that look? I'd be just as bad as Trump. No one would make that argument. You would say, if anything, this is a more liberal opportunity for more debate. It ought to be the case that bills are debatable for 6 hours. But of course, if it was the House rule that bills were debatable for 6 hours, some bills would need 8. Some bills would only need 1 because it's renaming a post office. You only need 45 minutes, whatever it is. The point is that House rules are not sacrosanct, even more so than by far than in the Senate. Every single bill, with the exception of motions to suspend the rules and pass the bill, which require a 2/3 vote, another topic for another day, and another procedural trick sometimes used. But every single bill that comes to the House floor is considered under rules that technically violate the House rules. If that were really the threshold, then you'd get nothing done, or everything would have to be done in an hour. But do freshman members, new members of the House know that? No. Sometimes even members who've been there for a couple of times know that. Yes, but they don't think about it because it's such a routine. It would be ludicrous to propose to people the idea that an open rule violates House rules, but it does. And as Josh is talking about, Josh Hooter in this thread, it's about theory, right? This is what all of this stuff is about. Unless leaders want an excuse, as they said, or rather, so whether an amendment violates the House rules is irrelevant unless leaders want as an excuse to prevent the amendment in the first place. In the quote from the leadership aide above, the leadership staffer laying the groundwork to reject the amendment violates House rules. Therefore, it cannot be okayed by the Rules Committee to go to the floor. Sure it can. In theory, this is accurate. We can't violate House rules. We are the Rules Committee. In practice, though, it is nonsense. And I mean, he really means it, nonsense. That's what this last half hour has been about. How nonsensical is it? Because in every circumstance today, every bill, right, the Rules Committee ensures House rules are irrelevant to floor debate. If they weren't, you would only be able to debate things for 1 hour, and members would only be able to speak for 5 minutes apiece on these things. And then you'd get into trying to extend debate by using the old thing we discussed a couple weeks ago. Once again, right, I move to strike the last word. That's dealing with default House rules and their workings. So if the Rules Committee didn't want House rules to prevent the amendment about repealing the Hyde Amendment, they wouldn't. This speaks to how the institutional rules impact political negotiations behind the scenes, Josh continues. Leaders leverage their institutional knowledge, i.e. bully other people, and power to affect the politics of policies. The gavel controls. Procedure rules everything. In this case, progressives' amendments went too far, according to the leadership. Leaders can easily claim it is a violation of the House rules. It is. Leaders can present this strong argument to the caucus, justifying their decision to strike it, an action possible because of other institutional powers. In short, overlapping rules and powers enable leaders to influence debate and politics. That's just obviously true. And that's his first conclusion. But he continues here. Progressives would have had a stronger procedural footing to strike Hyde had they not included additional language. And I don't know what the language is. That could take us another hour to parse. This would not have guaranteed the coverage they sought, but leadership would not have been able to so easily cast it aside or manipulate its politics. That is true. And perhaps a weaker version of what the progressives wanted could have avoided the accusation that it violates House rules. Well, you know what, though? It really couldn't have, because, as I explained to you, a special rule from the Rules Committee violates House rules. That's just the way it is. But progressives could have been on stronger procedural footing if more people knew this stuff. Even members of Congress sometimes don't know exactly what the hell they're talking about when it comes to this stuff. I mean, you could have stood up in the caucus meeting when the leadership said, yeah, we like it and all, we're just like you, but this violates House rules, so we couldn't allow it. And the answer could have been, oh, come on. Everybody knows what that means. It means nothing. Josh Hooter even knows, and he's not a member of the House. That idiot blogger guy with the podcast knows that you could easily protect this language if you wanted to. Why don't you want to? That would have been a much different fight. Progressives could have been on stronger procedural footing with a different, weaker amendment, but they also could have stood up and said, look, it doesn't matter. Just as the rules don't matter, my language doesn't matter. What you're saying is you don't want this amendment to happen. Why is that? And Josh continues here. Again, institutions constrain policy. What is politically possible is limited by existing institutional power. Here, progressives' best procedural argument limits policy provisions they can offer sans leadership's acquiescence. Of course, there are still several unknowns. Here's the part where it really matters. Leaders may be leaning on the rules as cover so others in the caucus can avoid this vote. Let's pick on Abigail Spanberger again. I have no idea where she is on this amendment. But again, we'll use the parallel of impeachment. I absolutely cannot have this thing come to a head. Because I substantively agree, but politically can't be seen doing it, because I believe that my district is so closely split. You can easily imagine that on an issue of abortion, couldn't you? They may not want this floor fight, by the way, not only because though they think they would win it and be happy to do so in the House, it would be very, very dead, as Josh says, in the Senate. So why force members, Democratic members, or even the one or two pro-life members who still exist, or members in marginal districts where there's a strong pro-life contingent that still can be convinced to vote Democratic, as they did in the 2018 election, allegedly. Do you want to force members to take that vote and have to go home and explain, yeah, I've been kind of walking a tightrope for a long time, but the truth is ultimately I am pro-choice, and strongly enough that I would vote to repeal the Hyde Amendment? Do you want to force them to defend that position? I mean, I do, sure, but does it mean we might lose the seat? Some people think so. So we'll finish out with this Josh thread here. This illuminates another unknown. Progressives may have intentionally added language ensuring its defeat to prohibit its consideration. Well, that's pretty Byzantine. But it could happen.
Enthusiasms.
Right? Yeah, they got enthusiasms for it, but that's not what we needed to say. That's the next button over from the music that we needed. That ruined the mood. Could it be the case? It could be the case. But what would that require? That would require the strong pro-choice repeal the Hyde Amendment progressives to say, I can't afford politically in my district with my constituency to back down from my promise to fight to repeal the Hyde Amendment, but Nancy Pelosi and the leadership are telling me, no, please don't, for other reasons. How do I satisfy Nancy Pelosi, to whom I may be very, very loyal politically and personally, and my constituency? And the answer is offer this amendment that is so broad that it sets up this rules no-no that the speaker winks at me and says, we can't do this because it violates the rules. Take that home and tell people that. I wanted to fight for my promise to repeal the Hyde Amendment, but the rules simply said no. And you know how we feel about rules. I would be no better than Trump if I violated this rule. Will it work? It would have, minus this last hour of the Kagro in the Morning Show, if you were listening. There are other examples just like it. The legislative landscape is littered with them, just to end things on an alliterative note.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
All right, so did that help or hurt? Was it illuminating in any way? Did you already know this? Well, if you did, I apologize, and we can spend the next hour with Justice Putnam on the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy, learning things you didn't yet know, because, well, he likes, unlike me, to include a variety of topics in his last hour. Stay tuned.